Afternoon, everybody. Everybody ready to be almost done? I am. But I'm talking, so that's fine. This will be great. We're going to hear today to talk about the other 80% of data. My name is Mike Kaiser. I'm part of the CTO's office at Sailpoint. And this is not really going to be technical bit after technical bit. Instead, I find it's easier to communicate the idea here with a really, really big analogy. Does anybody remember in early April the Chinese satellite that came down, the Chinese space station? It was Tiangong-1, right? The Chinese government lost control of it. People didn't know where it was going to come down. People got worried. Newspaper headlines kind of riveted around the world. Where's it going to land? Where's it going to land? Well, it turns out that's not the first thing to re-enter in a fireball, nor will it be the last. You see, since the 1950s, since the beginning of the space race, countries have raced to place objects into what we'll call low Earth orbit. And a lot of these have great function, right? They do GPS, or they do communications things, or maybe they do some kind of Earth sensing, like weather satellites that helped us detect that Harvey was coming to the Gulf Coast last August. But over time, as more and more countries entered, things got congested. And by the time of, late 2010s, and today you have about 4,766 objects. But again, those are just the good ones, right? The ones that are bad, the ones that are pieces of space junk or old boosters or satellites that countries put up and then abandoned and forgot about, well, this is the view of those. And there's a lot more of those, more on the order of 14,000 objects, or about 75% of all the stuff that's out orbiting space right now. And it's dangerous junk because it's traveling in excess of 17,000 miles an hour. That's fast enough to put a chink in the windshield of the International Space Station, just like a rock kicked up by a semi on the interstate. And it's not just dangerous to people in space either, because there have been 20,000 re-entries of these objects since the beginning of space exploration, which is actually one per day, every day, for the last 60 years. So it's happening over and over again. And really, what you hear about are not the small ones every day. You hear about the big ones that dominate the headlines, right? The most prominent of these probably was Skylab. I don't know if anyone was around back then. I was a little young, but I remember seeing the headlines later on. In 1979, Skylab, the U.S. government lost control of it as well. It had expired its useful life, and it was going to come down somewhere. And people freaked out. Much like the movie Independence Day, they had multiple extreme reactions. Some people went on top of skyscrapers and other large buildings with binoculars looking to see if they could see it re-enter, while other people went and hid in caves, worried they'd be crushed by the falling debris. And this seems really extreme, right? But not so extreme when you think about what happened the year before. In 1978, there was the worst disaster with some space junk re-entering and posing danger or damage to people on the ground. The Soviet satellite Cosmos came down over northern Canada, only this one had at its core a nuclear reactor. Once it had re-entered and blazed a trail across northern Canada, it left a line of radioactive waste that was 630 kilometers long. After the ongoing cleanup costs and litigation between Canada and Russia, it cost the Canadian government $13.9 million back in 1978, to say nothing of the damage and the loss to people on the ground. So this is a picture then of what's up in space right now, right? Some of these objects, some of these satellites are good, providing GPS or other use cases for humanity, but the vast majority is not. The vast majority is junk, abandoned or forgotten, and dangerous. And the reason I go through that whole storyline is because our businesses find ourselves in a similar position. We have employees that are taking data out of our applications, putting it in small files, and uploading it to network shares, to cloud storage, and it's in orbit around our businesses. And it's not a small problem, right? Statistics say it's up to 80% of enterprise data is in this format, orbiting our businesses, forgotten, unknown, and dangerous. And the dangerous part really doesn't kick in until you realize that a lot of this might be sensitive data, stuff related to GDPR, or maybe healthcare information about our employees, or credit card data for our customers, or intellectual property, or something else that is crucial to our business. And that's important because, as we all know, this is the stuff, the gold, if you will, that people are going after when they try and exploit, try and commit breaches. And they are obviously increasing. You know, in 2017, almost 8 billion with a B people had information compromised. That's 8 billion people last year rebuilding their credit, setting up their financial systems, recreating their identity. And as you'd expect, as the breaches increase, so do the number of records, just underscoring our problem. And like I said before, I was setting up an analogy with space junk. Well, space junk is re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and hitting the Earth each and every day. And so are breaches, right? With over 14 breaches per day and 2 million records per day being compromised, which is way worse than a space junk problem will ever be. And while we only hear about the really large breaches, you know, it only takes one. It only takes one set of customer financial data to break that reputation with our customers. Only one lapse in intellectual property to hand over that trade secret to a competitor. Only one to cause damage and loss to our businesses and our customers, and to put ourselves in the headlines in the worst way possible. So this is not just a picture then of what's in Earth's orbit. It's not just a picture of satellites in orbit, but it's also a picture of data in orbit around our businesses. Some of it good, some of it useful, some of it serving the business, but the majority not. The majority put up there for convenience and then possibly forgotten about, abandoned, and dangerous. So we know what the problem is, but let's talk about more what the solution is. The good news is that identity governance, I believe, has a new frontier to conquer. That we understand applications and privileges and entitlements in that environment, but this data orbiting our businesses is the next thing, right? It's crying out for governance, isn't it? Some of it's good, some of it's bad. It needs to be controlled. It needs to be governed. And what we can do in the time we have today is I want to give you kind of an overview of what that looks like. Moving from identity governance for applications into this new frontier of identity governance for files or for data. And we'll do it kind of in 4 steps. And we'll do it based off of how governments have dealt with space debris over the last 60 years. And so the first one, like you'd expect, is visibility, right? Now, in the space program, when they started, they realized, oh, crap, this is a problem. We can't just put things up into orbit. So what they started doing was they started keeping track of it, right? They have a database, all the way starting from Vanguard and Sputnik, you can see. It has, launch locations, inclination, orbital trajectory, who's responsible for it, what year it was. And that gave them an idea of what should be out there. But then they quickly realized, there's more out there than what should be. We need to know what is. And so what they started doing was they started putting installations like this one in Tenerife, owned by Spain. These are laser telescopes that can go out and detect what's actually out there. And so now they had what should be and what is. And we need the same thing. We need to know what data is out there, where it is. we need to know what kind it is. Is it sensitive? Is it not sensitive? And then finally, we need to know who has access to all of that data and what does that access look like. Now, this may seem fairly simple, straightforward, but it's a little bit more difficult than you might at first think, right? A lot of us have done identity governance for applications and for infrastructure with databases and mainframes and things that SAP, things that we know how it works. But this new frontier of data with files out there as one-offs is a little bit different. If you think about access and governing access, if we're talking about governing access of entitlements and privileges in applications and systems, it's pretty straightforward, right? Each application has its own central definition of what you can do and can't do. Similarly, you know what's sensitive and not sensitive in the sense of, is this a normal user taking action or is this a privileged user taking action? We kind of know how it's used. And as a result of all of these, it's fairly limited in number. Now, there are certain applications like SAP that could have thousands of entitlements, but most often they're reduced into a manageable set. Well, if you look at data with file storage systems, the game changes a little bit. No longer is there central definition in one place where you can go and grab that information and put it into your identity governance system. It's defined file per file per file at the location it is. Secondly, you don't know what's sensitive and what's not sensitive. You don't know what's important and what's not important. So you have to figure that out. You have to know how it's being used. In other words, is someone actually using this data, or is it from 5 years ago and no one touches it and no one needs it? And all of these combine to make this really, really difficult problem set, because now instead of a predefined, proscribed space, now this could expand and scale beyond our means really rapidly. So as we try and address all these issues identified on the right, what we're doing is we're reducing the problem set, making it more and more manageable so that we can handle it. Let's talk a little bit more detail about how we do that. First off, if we're going to figure out what permissions, what access there is out there, well, it's not centrally located, so somehow we're going to have to do some kind of permissions analysis. It's going to go out, sweep across all these installations and pull down the permissions so we can begin to govern them. Then we're going to do some data classification. We'll figure out what's sensitive, what's not, what's important, what's not, what's worrisome, and what may not be. And then finally, and most interestingly in a way, we'll do some activity monitoring to find out, is anybody even using this in the first place? So if we combine all these together, we're reducing our problem set. Because instead of trying to govern all of this, we're just trying to govern what's important. What's important, especially in terms of risk, right? Because when we do permissions analysis, we find out what's wide open. We find out who everybody and their dog can get access to. When we do data classification, we find out what's sensitive. And that's really one of the core elements here is where the sensitive data is. Because if it's not important, if it's like your grandmother's recipe for lasagna, maybe we don't want to protect that all that much. It may not be that valuable. Now, if it is, let me know. I'd like a really good lasagna recipe, but that's a side issue. Then, finally, activity monitoring. We're seeing what's used and what's not used. So not only does it identify what might be old, what may not have been used in a long time, it shows us what may not be necessary. So if we refine this just a little bit, we see we have three main areas of risk, right? With these three activities, we've seen that we can find unrestricted access to sensitive data, which is pretty scary. And we can see unnecessary access to sensitive data, doing nothing but increasing our attack surface, increasing our risk. And then we see unnecessary and unrestricted access. It's kind of a worst case scenario. And all of this ties into visibility, right? Without this three-ring circus, in a way, it becomes difficult to really have a clear view into what's out there, where it is, and who has access to it, and build up into this model, right? Like I said before, we want to know what it is, where it is it sensitive, and who has what kind of access to it. If we have all of these pieces in a manageable size, then we can start applying identity governance that we already know and love, that we're already good at, to the new frontier of data. So we talked about visibility. Next, let's move on to ownership. Now, ownership in the space program also is fairly straightforward at first, right? You put it into orbit, you own it, right? So as each country put things into orbit, they were responsible for maintaining communication with it, maintaining contact with it, and just classic ownership definitions. Now, it wasn't always clear who owned a fragment of something, right? You find a piece of rocket booster, it may be difficult to know, is it Russia, is it the United States, who is it? Well, they would go in and they would do the math. Thankfully, we have physics, which helps us put the stuff up in the first place, but now we can say, where is it, what speed is it, what trajectory is it going at, and now we can backtrack, do the math, do the physics, and say, oh, that's Botswana, or whatever country put it up there originally. The same is true with sensitive data. What we can do is we can assign owners to this. Just like you have application owners and identity governance for traditional applications, now we can have people who are responsible for this store of sensitive data. And this makes a lot of sense, right? If you choose the right owner, which is relatively easy much of the time, then they're the ones sensitive, they're the ones closest to the data, they're the ones who own that data, it's their data, and so they should obviously be the owners. Now, it's not always obvious who should be the owner. Just like in the space program, sometimes you find difficult situations, and so we can apply to that, we can apply some innovation to that in the forms of things like crowdsourcing, where instead of assigning owners, we can say, hey, I noticed you're using this financial data. In this folder, who do you think you should be the owner of this data? Here's 4 users to choose from, or here, and a blank to fill in a name. And so we can take that under advisement in choosing the right owner for it. Basically, we're doing the math. We're doing the physics here just like you would in the space program. And I say taking it under advisement because it's part of a healthy process, right? The wisdom of the crowd may not always be that wise. So we take that under advisement. Regardless, we wind up with having owners now for this sensitive data. And we've seen how we needed to get visibility into the data, and now we've established owners. And now that we have owners, we can start to expect them to own it, to start to do corrective actions to ameliorate our situation. Now, in the space program, as I said before, we have owners, right? Countries who are responsible, at least in the public forum, for these objects. Now, as they owned them, especially if they were fragments, they were responsible for making sure that didn't hurt anyone, which is why it's a big deal. In my opening story, I talked about countries losing control of objects. People start to worry, because then you don't know where it's going, you can't control it, you can't protect anyone, right? Now, most often, these are fragments or sometimes very large vehicles, and what they do is they try and change the orbit such so that the trajectory happens so they burn up in the atmosphere naturally. Now, that doesn't always work, and believe it or not, there's an entire industry that has sprung up with cleaning up space junk with, believe it or not, lasers, which gives me a reason to show this really cool graphic that I did not draw myself. But the point is, companies like SpaceX and some others are actually doing some work to clean this up. Because if we're going to use low Earth orbit as a launching pad to other planets and other space travel, we're already in a lot of trouble. Same thing with our example, right? We have data owners. And so what we can start doing is having them review who already has access and start cleaning that up. Start being an owner for who has entitlements or permissions on that data. And so we can start to take a situation like this, where there's sensitive data all over the place, and we can find out as owners what's necessary, what's not, start reducing access, and we move into a more cleaned up environment, just like we hope to do with space junk, through things like certifications and access request controls. Basically, they are responsible, little mini compliance officers, for this sensitive data. And then finally, we've seen that we need visibility. That visibility leads into ownership. leads into our owners starting to take corrective action and doing things with that information, which leads me to our last segment, which is continuous monitoring, for lack of a better word. And mainly, this has to do with our environments constantly changing. I'm from Austin, Texas. I really like Boston this week because it's not really hot. When I left Austin, it was 99. The next day I've been here, it was 100. Today I think it's 101. I'm assuming we're going to continue, and by the weekend it'll be 115. Anyway, the point is, other than being really hot, the weather's constantly changing. I'm sure the same thing is true here. And so if we have visibility and ownership in the things I talked about, we have to constantly be updating that view so that we know what's out there, so that we can handle it and manage it. Now, the easiest analogy I can give for this in terms of space exploration happened about 2009, 2008. Once again, a Russian satellite, this one called Cosmos, struck a GPS Iridium satellite because guess what? The Russians lost control of Cosmos. And we went from an environment where just looking at these two objects, we started with two discrete objects orbiting the Earth. And then after the collision, it turned into 3,000 fragments orbiting the Earth. A rather more dangerous situation than before, right? Risk has gone up. I'm not trying to throw the Russians under the bus, by the way. It just happens to, all my examples happen to be with them. But the same thing happens in our environments, right? Nothing is static. This may be the view on Monday, but we need some way to update our view so that as things change, we know and we can adapt. You know, you may have some GDPR data go away, but then you may have someone who just started in your finance department and is starting to pump file after file after file into some online share. And so we need to know about this. And another interesting thing is, you know, I talked about not throwing the Russians under the bus, but legally they were held culpable. They were held responsible for that collision. And so part of the game also is finding out who or what process was responsible for this kind of increased risks in our environments. Not just to lay blame, but to improve our process, to close those gaps that are causing risk and causing this dangerous situation to take place. And so one of the things we can do with that activity monitoring is we can take real-time or near real-time responses. In other words, if a user does something like copying or uploading a sensitive file, we can check the identity context. We can say, well, did this person have the right to do that? Does this seem like part of their normal job function? And if it does, we can let it go. We can do a certification. We can do policy checks to make sure that it's within the bounds of the normal scope of their job. Or we can cause, as in this slide calls out, a certification to make sure this is approved by someone in charge. If it fails any of those, we can take remedial action. We can delete the file, we can shut down the account, we can suspend that person's identity, assuming they're compromised, and shut down their identity and remove all their accounts throughout the business. It just depends on what the business model is and what the action that needs to take place would be. Either way, we have a trail, an audit trail, where we can see who is responsible, how it took place, how the environment changed over time, kind of a root cause. And this is still part of that extension of identity governance. All these terms that I've been talking about shouldn't be new to you. Certifications and SOD policy and data owners being like application owners. This is all the same tools we've had all along. So we've seen just kind of in these four broad areas, comparing it to the space program, how, you know, data in orbit around our businesses, we need to see into it what's out there. And once we get a really good handle, and this is obviously the long pool, on what's out there, who has access to it, where the sensitive data is, we can prioritize and we can start to make owners for that data. They can be responsible for making sure it's used properly. And not only responsible for new requests being approved properly, but also for taking corrective action and cleaning it up and improving our situation. And then finally, we can use activity monitoring to do that continuous monitoring, that continuous visibility into the environment, and then also seeing when change happens that's bad, taking action, and diagnosing it, finding out the root process, the root cause, and eliminating those from our business. So all this should sound really familiar from identity governance. And as we implement these tools and these processes that we already know, that we already have, that we've already developed, and that we're already good at, we can move from a world that's like this, as I said before, where some data orbiting our businesses serves the business, but the majority is chaotic, forgotten, and dangerous, into more of a world like this, where all the data orbiting our business has a business purpose. It serves the business. It does what it's supposed to. It's brought into compliance to the process of identity governance. And as we apply these tools and these concepts we already know and are already good at, in the end, we'll see that bringing identity governance to the next frontier of data really isn't rocket science after all. Tip your waiters. Any questions? Sure. It can work hand in hand. I would say explicitly it is not DLP, because that's this kind of process or this idea is not DLP, because it's not really trying to be preventative from preventing things from happening, other than having bad access or unwarranted access. In other words, if someone requests access to sensitive data they should not have, then the identity governance processes being in place should restrict that from being granted. But we're not going to prevent you from copying a file or something like that. We're governing the process that exists. It can work hand in hand with something like DLP, though, because if you think of that, the first visibility step with classification and identifying data, that's kind of the same process. So we're already talking to other vendors, at least us at Sailpoint, and I think us in large, in general, I think there's an opportunity to meld those two. To say, you already have some information about classification, I'll inform you, you inform me. We're not going to try and do real time, because we want governance and audit trail and basically classic identity governance, but we're all about preemptive reinforcement too with DLP. So I see them working as hand in hand as part of a more full-fledged, fully developed protection for data orbiting the business, so to speak. Yeah, I know it's a long-winded answer, sorry. Once I got started talking. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, everyone.